Hello, I am very privileged to give you a talk on my favorite subject, hummingbirds. I tell my friends that if hummingbirds knew how much I love them, they would fly up to my face and kiss me on the lips. DNA evidence shows that hummingbirds and swifts diverged from a common ancestor in Eurasia, that's Europe and Asia, about 42 million years ago. They are only found in the Western Hemisphere, and there is a total of 358 worldwide species. 57 species are seen in North America, 27 species in the United States, and 19 species have been documented in Texas, the most of any other state. In 2004, the BBC News Service reported that 2 hummingbird fossils with modern hummingbird anatomy dating back to 30 million years ago had been found in southern Germany. Since that time, at least 6 additional fossils dating back to about the same time period have been found in Germany, Poland, and France. And this is that original BBC News Service article from 2004 describing the 2 30-million-year-old hummingbird fossils found in southern Germany. Well, how did hummingbirds get from Europe and Asia to the Western Hemisphere? One popular theory is that they crossed an ancient land bridge, Beringia, between Siberia and Alaska, and then flew south to South America about 22 million years ago and evolved into multiple species, and then flew over to North America about 12 million years ago, and then to the Caribbean islands about 5 million years ago. Birds have a right-sided aorta. Humans have a left-sided aorta. The aorta is the main artery which comes off the heart. It's huge and it supplies the entire body with blood except for the lungs. And female birds are born with 2 ovaries, but the right one quickly atrophies. In other words, it shrinks, and when the bird is completely mature, the right ovary is totally absent, leaving the bird with only a left ovary to save weight. Hummingbirds have 2 eyelids, an upper eyelid which slides down to meet the lower eyelid. They also have a nictitating membrane, which all birds have, and this is a semi-opaque membrane which slides down over the front of the eyeball and protects it from blowing dust and other particles as well as other foreign bodies. This is a semi-opaque membrane, and the bird can see well enough to fly through this membrane. Some people will call the nictitating membrane a third eyelid. Hummingbird feet are very weak. They almost never walk. Their feet do allow perching, and they can move sideways on the perch. Hummingbirds have 14 or 15 cervical vertebrae, in other words, neck, spine segments. Humans have 7. The fewest number of bird cervical vertebrae is seen in the blue and yellow macaw with 10, and the most is 23, seen within the mute swan. The hummingbird brain is 4.2% of its total body weight. The human brains are 2% of their total body weight. The hummingbird heart is 2.5% of its total weight, the largest ratio of any warm-blooded animal. And hummingbirds have lots of red blood cells which carry oxygen in the blood. They have 6,590,000 per cubic millimeter of blood. Humans have 5 million red blood cells per cubic millimeter of blood. The skeleton. Flightless birds have thicker and heavier bones, and bones contain fatty and red blood cell producing bone marrow. And most major avian bones in birds that fly are pneumatic. In other words, they have air within them. And the air is their in the form of air sacs, which communicate with the lung tissue, or they're due to direct extension of lung tissue itself. And these bones have very thin walls. The downside of that arrangement is that if the bird fractures one of these bones, he may bleed into the lungs and die. The hummingbird's tongue is tubular with side-by-side channels and a forked tip and multiple lamellae, which are thin tissue membranes which cover the tip of the tongue. The tongue is typically flicked in and out 15 to 20 times a second by hummingbirds. And when the tongue is extended, in other words, when it is flicked out of the beak, it goes through the beak, which is almost completely closed, flattening out the tongue. And when the tongue tip touches nectar, by reflex action, there is dilatation of the tongue and a rapid ingress of nectar into the tongue, and the bird opens its beak just enough to accommodate the dilated tongue, which is then quickly retracted into its mouth. And then the bird flicks its tongue out again through a beak that is almost completely closed, flattening the tongue out and stripping the nectar from the tongue into its mouth. Feathers and color. Iridescent feathers in hummingbirds color is not due to color-specific pigment, but due to the microscopic anatomy of the feather components, which is genetically controlled, and by the angle of incidence of the light striking those feathers. So that in any given species with light striking certain feathers at a certain angle of incidence, a dominant color will be produced. And then if that angle of incidence of light changes slightly, in other words, if the bird changes its head position slightly, or other body position slightly, a shade of that dominant color will be produced. And then if the angle of incidence of the light striking the feathers changes dramatically, then all of the colors are annihilated, creating black. Non-iridescent colored feathers contain color pigment. Physiology. Hummingbirds are very hypermetabolic. Their body temperature is 105 degrees Fahrenheit. Their heart rate is 250 beats per minute while perching, 500 beats per minute while hovering, and can get up to 1260 beats per minute. Respiratory rate is 200 to 250 breaths per minute. Wing beat frequency while hovering is species specific, so that the bee hummingbird, the smallest hummingbird from Cuba, has a wing beat frequency of 80 beats per second, and the largest hummingbird, the giant hummingbird from the Davis Mountains, has a wing beat frequency while hovering of 10 beats per second. Flight speed varies, but is normally about 30 miles an hour. 50 miles an hour during escape, and during the Anna's hummingbird's courtship dive, speeds of 60 miles an hour can be reached. Weight in hummingbirds is species specific, with the bee hummingbird weighing 1.6 grams and the giant hummingbird weighing 20 grams. There are 29.5 grams per ounce. Hearing in birds and hummingbirds is excellent. Taste and smell in hummingbirds not so much. They can taste differences in nectar, and at least in the black-chin hummingbirds, they have a rudimentary sense of smell, and possibly in other species also. Lifespan, of course, will vary, but is generally between 3 and 7 years in wild hummingbirds, with females living slightly longer than males. The longest lived wild banded hummingbird was a female broad-tailed hummingbird living in Colorado that reached the age of 12 years and 2 months. In captivity, they can live for 16 or 17 years. This is a drawing of a human eye. It's pretty similar to the hummingbird eye. We can see on the left that the front of the eye contains the cornea, which is a transparent structure that allows light into the eye, and the light goes through the pupil, and the pupil is created by the iris. And the iris is the colored portion of the front of the eye, so that if somebody says you have blue eyes, it's because you've got blue pigment in your iris. Then light passes across the lens where it's focused to the retina, to the back of the retina, and the retina contains rods and cones, which are photoreceptor cells. And then the direct vision, usually the light falls on or near the fovea, which is an indentation in the retina, and the fovea is part of the macula. The macula isn't shown on this, it's not indicated on this drawing, but the macula surrounds the fovea and is kind of a poorly defined area, but it contains a dense concentration of cones, and cones are responsible for color vision and visual acuity. So the photoreceptor cells, in receiving the light, impulses are created which travel along the retina into the optic nerve up to the brain, where the brain interprets those impulses as images. Hummingbird vision is excellent. Bird vision is the best in the animal kingdom. Lots of rods for black and white vision and nighttime vision, and lots of cones for visual acuity and color vision. Hummingbirds can also see the ultraviolet spectrum. Their own plumages reflect UV light, as do the plumages of other birds, and certain flowers at the height of nectar production will reflect UV light. Hummingbirds have binocular vision, and they have cryptochromes in their retina and iron oxide crystals in their beak to detect the Earth's geomagnetic field to help with direction finding during migration. Nectar is their energy drink, which is sucrose and water. Sucrose is table sugar, and for you chemistry majors, sucrose is a disaccharide made up of glucose and fructose attached to each other. They also eat spiders and small insects for their other nutritional requirements, including proteins, carbohydrates, and lipids or fats, as well as their complex carbohydrates, essential amino acids, essential fatty acids, vitamins, and minerals. They likewise consume a small amount of pollen, which has carbohydrates, lipids, and proteins, as well as B vitamins. They're the smallest warm-blooded animal, and they burn more energy per weight than any other warm-blooded animal. And they are second in the animal kingdom to large flying insects in the amount of energy usage per weight. This little female calliope is in torpor. As we've learned, hummingbirds are very hypermetabolic, and they eat normally about every 15 minutes and have small fuel tanks. So that if they didn't have a way to diminish their metabolism on a cold night, they could starve to death. And they can diminish their metabolism by entering a state called torpor. They enter this state shortly after dark and typically will recover from torpor about an hour or two before daybreak. This little female calliope slept in this morning. They diminish their body temperature from 105 degrees Fahrenheit down into the 50s. and they diminish their heart rate from 250 beats per minute into the 50s or 60s. And they diminish their respiratory rate from 200 to 250 breaths per minute to 1 or 2 breaths per minute. So you can see that they markedly decrease their metabolism, which allows them to survive the night. They also enter torpor if they are malnourished or if they are sick. The downside of torpor is that it is a state of semi-hibernation and they are unconscious and very vulnerable to predators. This is a mature male black-chin showing us its figure-of-8 wing motion during hovering. Hummingbirds don't flap their wings like other birds because their hand, wrist, and elbow joints are fused. They have straight wing motion. The leading edge is thicker than the trailing edge, creating the Bernoulli effect for lift. And we can see on frame 1 that the position of the wings is far to the rear, and it is coming forward during the forward portion of the stroke, and we can see that on frames 1 to frame 2 and frame 2 to frame 3. And then at frame 3, the wings are as far forward as they typically go, and the bird then rotates its wings at the shoulder so that the leading edge is facing backwards. And we can see this happening on frame 4. And then on the rearward stroke that we see on frame 4, 5, and 6, there is lift on the rearward stroke also, so that there is lift on both the forward and rearward strokes. Female black-chin extending her neck. I haven't seen very many humans that can do this. Hummingbirds love water, and this female black-chin hummingbird was washing off the sticky nectar from her beak and body, as well as cooling off on a hot summer's day and softening up her feathers for preening. And just like humans, they may want to take a shower occasionally, and this hummingbird was enjoying a sprinkler. This is a female black-chin hummingbird drinking water and extending her tongue. The beak is closed, and she is flicking her tongue in and out 15 to 20 times a second, creating small splashes in the water adjacent to her tongue. And this is a mature male broadbill who put his tongue in some nectar, and the tongue dilated reflexly, and the bird opened its beak just enough to accommodate the distended tongue filled with nectar, and he's quickly retracting his tongue into his mouth. Male versus female broadbill near a feeder. They're very feisty and very territorial. This is a white-lined sphinx moth. I was photographing hummingbirds in Hondo, New Mexico, and thought that this was a hummingbird that was at a flower, but when I put my telephoto lens on it, I realized it was a moth, a white-lined sphinx moth. This was an immature male ruby-throated eyeing a praying mantis on a feeder in my backyard in Abilene. They were both eyeing each other very intently. Hummingbirds are afraid of praying mantises because praying mantises can catch and kill and eat hummingbirds. But this hummingbird was too smart and too quick for the praying mantis, and the praying mantis had to make do with a bee for lunch on this day. I used to like praying mantises, but when I learned that they kill hummingbirds, I don't like them nearly as much as I used to. Frame A shows an immature male black-chin, which had been trapped in my son John's greenhouse. We released this bird unharmed. Frame B shows a mature male black-chin, which also had been trapped in my son John's greenhouse, and we released it unharmed. Frame C shows a ruby-throated hummingbird, which smacked into my back patio glass door. It was stunned, and I put the bird in my wife's hand and photographed it. It recovered, and I saw it at the feeders in my backyard for several days after that, doing great. Bills and flowers. In general, the bill of the hummingbird fits the size and shape of the flower. However, most flowers are visited by many different species of hummingbirds that have differences in their bill contour. There are two groups of hummingbirds that it relates to their bills, those with short, straight bills and those with long bills that are usually curved, and they're usually decurved with the tip pointing downward. And these birds with the long decurved bills are hermits, and they include the sickle bills, sword bills, lance bills, and incas. And there is an enormous overlap in their selection of flowers except for the sickle bill, which is locked into a relationship with two genus of flowers, the Centropogon and Heliconia. Frame 1 shows a magenta-throated wood star that I photographed in Costa Rica with a short, straight bill. Frame 2 shows a ruby-throated hummingbird with a medium bill and a slight decurve. In other words, it's slightly curved downward. And frame 3 shows a hummingbird with a very long bill that's curved downward. That's a decurve, and it is a green hermit from Costa Rica. Frame 4 is a picture that Christopher Witt, a brilliant ornithologist from the University of New Mexico at Albuquerque, he took this picture and is showing us a buff-tailed sicklebill and how its bill conforms completely to the contour of that Centropogon flower. There are tooth-billed hummingbirds from western Colombia and northwestern Ecuador, the Androdon equatorialis, and they have specialized bills for catching spiders and insects and piercing flowers for their nectar. And this is a picture of those bills. There are three lineages of nectarivores: hummingbirds, sunbirds from Africa and Asia, and honey eaters from various countries, predominantly from New Zealand and Australia. And this is a male greater double-collared sunbird from South Africa. I took this picture several years ago. Anna's hummingbirds are the first species I will discuss. All of the range and distribution maps are supplied courtesy of the Cornell Laboratory of Ornithology. Their slides are very accurate, though some of them fail to show significant populations of hummingbirds. Mature female Annas in San Diego. And this is an immature male Annas, and it's molting. There are little whitish tubular structures on its neck. Those are a keratin sheath which surround pin feathers. Pin feathers are the primary feathers that start beneath the skin, and they need stiffness to push up through the skin, and so these keratin sheaths provide that stiffness. Keratin is what your fingernails are made of. So the keratin sheaths help push up the pin feathers through the skin. An immature male Annas showing us its typical bird toe configuration: 3 toes in front, 1 toe in back, and that's called anisodactyly. Some birds, however, have 2 toes in front and 2 toes in back, such as the roadrunner, and that's called zygodactyly. This is an immature male Annas, and it is doing a courtship display. During a courtship display, the Annas can rocket up to about 130 feet and dive down and flaring their tail feathers out to create a chirping sound at the nadir of their dive, which can reach speeds up to 60 miles an hour. And then they undergo a pendulum motion next to the female of interest. And I watched this guy in Balboa Park for about an hour. Balboa Park is in San Diego. And never once did the female of his interest look at him. And there she is, and there he is, and I'm sure he must have had a broken heart. Mature male Annas, I took these pictures over a period of about a second or so, and the middle frame shows the certain angle of incidence that in this bird creates its dominant color, red. And then when the angle of incidence of the light striking those iridescent feathers changes slightly, in other words, the bird is changing its head position, as we can see in the frame on the left, shades of that color are produced. Brown on the crown of its head and sort of a rusty color on its throat. And even the red that we see is less intense than it is in the middle frame. And then when the angle of incidence of the light striking the feathers varies tremendously, like it is in the frame on the right, all of the colors are annihilated, creating black. And this is a mature male Annas that's molting, and it takes 10 to 15 days to acquire a new set of gorget or throat feathers. Mature male Annas, violet-crowned hummingbirds. They're sexually monomorphic, meaning the males and females look alike. They predominantly live in Mexico, and we see them in southeast Arizona and southern New Mexico and in West Texas, even though the map does not show the full extent of where they live. And this is a violet crown with a red beak and a black tip. Another one, and another one. Broad-billed hummingbirds. They live predominantly in Mexico, but we also see them in southeast Arizona, southern New Mexico, and into West Texas. Mature female broadbill, a little bit of reddish in the bottom of her beak near her face, and the front part of her body has whitish non-iridescent feathers. This is an immature male broadbill that does have iridescent feathers on its throat and chest, and it is molting. A mature male broadbill, red throughout most of its beak and a black tip, lots of iridescent feathers that we can see. Mature male broadbill, I took this picture in southeast Arizona in Madera Canyon. Mature male broadbill, look at that face. Much prettier than Marilyn Monroe. Costas, they live in the southwest. And this is a female Costas with a 10-day-old chick in a nest taken by my friend Steve May, who's a pathologist and lives in Corpus Christi. Typically, hummingbirds have 2 eggs in a brood. And so we see only one chick. Likely the other chick died. Rarely, hummingbirds may lay only 1 egg or can lay 3 eggs in a brood. This is a Costas 3-week-old chick sitting on the edge of her nest. I photographed this bird in southeast Arizona. And this is a bearded hummingbird, an immature male Costas. And as we have learned, The pin feathers, which are the primary feathers, the brand new feathers, start beneath the skin, and then there are keratin sheaths. Keratin is what your fingernails are made of. Keratin sheaths surround these little pin feathers and give them stiffness to push up through the skin, and they keep growing. And once the keratin sheaths and pin feathers have reached their maximum growth, the keratin sheaths hang around for another day or two, and then the keratin sheaths fall off, leaving the adult feathers. Until the keratin sheaths fall off, though, the hummingbird can have this bearded appearance. Mature male costus. Broadtail. This is an immature female broadtail, courtesy of my son John when he was living in Tucson. And this is an immature male broadtail in my backyard in Abilene. And we can see it has the typical wing feather relationship. There are 10 primary feathers in the wing, with the top feather being called P10, primary 10, and then underneath that is P9, primary 9, and then under that is P8 and so forth. And this is the typical anatomy of the wing feathers in hummingbirds. Immature male broadtail, mature male broadtail. And this is a mature male broadtail. And you can see that the tip of P10, that upper feather in its wing, the tip of it is flattened and it curves slightly upward, and there's a space between P10 and P9. And even though it's hard to tell, P9 is also slightly deformed. Same way with this mature male broadtail. We can see that the tip of P10 is flattened. There's a space between P10 and P9, and P9 is slightly deformed. All mature male broadtails have this typical feather configuration, this anomalous feather configuration that other hummingbirds don't have. And it creates an unusual sound when they are hovering or flying. It's a metallic trill sound, and it's unique to that hummingbird. So people who are experienced with hummingbirds can tell that they're hearing a mature male broadtail even though they cannot see the bird. This mature male broadtail is showing us its white feathers beneath its beak. It's got a white chin. Mature male broadtail, we see white chin feathers on the base of its beak where its throat starts, and white feathers underneath its eye. And then on the back part of its eye we see white feathers. That's called a postocular white spot. Most, though not all, hummingbirds have that. Ruby-throated hummingbirds. They're the second most widely distributed hummingbird and the only breeding species east of the Mississippi River. And some of the birds will fly across the Gulf of Mexico on their southward bound migration for the winter. And those birds will gather along the Gulf Coast and gain weight in the form of stored fat. They can even double their weight for the long trip across the Gulf of Mexico, which can be up to 500 miles. Female ruby-throated, and this is an immature male ruby-throated. Each little black dot on its throat as the bird matures will become an iridescent feather. My wife loved this little bird in our backyard, and she named him Sweetie. And he hung around till the rest of the hummingbirds had migrated, and he was there for another month. And I saw this little guy on the morning of October 26th, 2018, and I did not see him in the afternoon and didn't see him anymore. So he migrated on October 26th, which is interesting because that's my birthday. Immature male ruby-throated, mature male ruby-throated. And we can see that it has a bright red gorget. Mature male ruby-throated. And its gorget has a rusty color. Mature male ruby-throated, bright red gorget. And mature male ruby-throated from a mature male broadtail, how to tell one from the other. You might say, well, the gorget has a slightly different dominant red color, and it does, but we have noticed that with a different angle of incidence of light striking these feathers, the dominant color can vary in its shading. And so the most accurate way to tell one from the other is that there are white chin feathers on the mature male broadtail, and a mature male ruby-throated has a black chin. And the mature male broadtail has white feathers underneath its eye, and the feathers underneath the ruby-throated's eye are black, and they both have the postocular white spot. Black chin hummingbirds are the third most widely distributed hummingbirds. Mature female black chin. Mature female black chin with a bug seen in the tip of its beak. Immature male black chin. Immature male black chin. Immature male black chin. Immature male black chin. In frame 1, this immature male black chin in my backyard was drinking nectar through the male portion of this Turk's cap flower. We can see in frame 3 where the anther is that generates the pollen. And so on frame 2, when he drinks nectar through the other part of the flower, the anther rubs on the crown of its head, depositing little pinkish pollen particles on frame 4 that we can see. Same way with this hummingbird. This immature male black-chinned hummingbird was being harassed by a honeybee. We can see that the bee's body is very large in relation to the hummingbird's body size. Bee stings can be fatal for hummingbirds. Fortunately, they can fly backwards. They can fly on their back. They can fly on their side. They can do somersaults in the air. And allegedly, they can also fly butt forward. So this hummingbird was able to avoid this bee by flying backwards. And we can see how effective this is. And on this picture, we notice that I happened to catch him while he was blinking, and his upper eyelid is coming down to meet the lower eyelid. And this is a leucistic black chin. Leucistic means that this is a partial albino. If this were a complete or full albino, the feathers would be totally white and the eye would be pink. So this is a partial albino. The colors are pale, tan in this case, and the eye is dark because of pigment in the iris. And this was sent to me by Greg Whipple, who lives in Silver City, New Mexico. Mature male black chin. Mature male black chin. And this is a hybrid hummingbird. I took this picture in Sedona, Arizona, and I didn't know what kind of hummingbird this was. And so I sent a copy of the picture to Dan Brown, who owns the Hummer House in Christoval, Texas, and he's seen lots and lots of hummingbirds. And Charles Floyd, who at the time was the resident hummingbird bander at the Humming House, and he's seen tens of thousands of hummingbirds up close in his hand, so to speak, as well as to Ross Hawkins, who is the founder and CEO of the International Hummingbird Society, and he sent the picture to Sherry Williamson, author of Peterson's Guide to the Hummingbirds of North America, and they all three agreed that this was a hybrid black-chin broadtail, which is the most common hybrid. Mature male black-chin, mature male black-chin, and another one. Calliope hummingbirds. They are the smallest of the North American hummingbirds. Mature male calliope, mature male calliope, and another one. The bees did not bother this bird. Another mature male calliope, and another one. Rufous. These hummingbirds are the most widely distributed hummingbirds, and they have the longest migration route. They can travel from Alaska deep into Mexico for a trip of 3,500 miles. Female rufous. Female rufous in Balboa Park in San Diego with pollen all over its throat and face. Female rufous. Immature male rufous. Mature male rufous. Mature male rufous. Mature male rufous. Mature male rufous. And we can see that I happen to catch him with his eyes in blinking mode, and the upper lid almost is reaching the lower lid. Mature male rufous. Lucifer, this is the last species we'll discuss. They live predominantly in Mexico, but we see them in southeast Arizona, southern New Mexico, and in West Texas. Mature female Lucifer. This is an immature male Lucifer. Another Lucifer, this is a mature male Lucifer. And another mature male. And another mature male Lucifer. And this is the last Lucifer picture. It's a close-up of his beautiful face. And that's the end of the talk. Thank you so very much for your attention.